Welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce you to and kick off our Just Culture of High Impact Case Studies today as part of our TMIT National Research Testbed High Performer webinar. I'm Charles Denham. I'm chairman of TMIT, and I'll be your host today. I just want to cover a couple of housekeeping details. Please, on your computer, increase your WebEx volume to the maximum and increase your computer volume and your external speaker volume to the maximum. If you, however, do not have adequate audio signal and good volume, then go to the participants icon, and I'm on slide 4 of the slides that may have been downloaded by you already, and click on that participants button, and then in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see a phone icon, and you can request a dial-in number, and that'll give you a better connection. The next topic or slide I just want to show you is slide number 5, and if you go to our landing page, for those of you that do not have the slides yet, go to www.safetyleaders.org, and in the upper right-hand quadrant, you will see the upcoming events. Click on that window, and you can click on the Just Culture High Impact Case Studies, and that will take you to where you can download the slides. I'm on slide 6 for those that have the slides, and I just want to remind you that you can go to this page to download additional resources, and we do have some papers, some medical papers, and some reports and surveys that will be cited in the news section, and you'll be able to go to watch that. And then in future, you'll be able to watch this program on that page. And for those of you that are coming to watch the enduring content online, this is the place where you are currently. Slide 7 addresses our social media addresses, which I won't go into. Slide 8 is our purpose statement, and our purpose is that we will measure our success by how we protect and enrich the lives of families, patients, and caregivers. And I think today's presentation from David Marx will be terrific in that it addresses both patients and caregivers and the issues that revolve around the continuum and those relationships as it relates to just culture. Our mission is to accelerate performance solutions that save lives, save money, and create value in the communities we serve and ventures we undertake. Slide number 9 is our disclosure slide. Please read it. However, we will not be discussing any medical technology device or pharmaceutical. We will be discussing Just Culture, which is proprietary information of David Marx, and we'd like to make sure that you respect the copyright of the slides and do not share them, but go to the Just Culture website and then follow those instructions. We're really excited to have our set of speakers and reactors today. We have David Marx, who I'll formally introduce shortly, however, probably needs no introduction. He is the pioneer and originator of the Just Culture movement, which has now become a global movement. John Nance, who is also a globally recognized individual for his nonfiction and fiction books, but more importantly for his work in patient safety, aviation safety as an ABC broadcaster, and a founder of many initiatives in patient safety. Dr. Greg Boats, who is a professor at the University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and a terrific contributor to patient safety globally, and Chief Bill Adcox from MD Anderson, who is one of our pioneers of, along with Dr. Boats, of the threat safety science movement globally that's being recognized as a way to really tackle threats across the full continuum. And then Jennifer Dingman, who has always been our steadfast supporter, a global patient safety advocate and a terrific voice of patients. And Jennifer has been a published author. She was a contributor to the NQF Safe Practices. She's served on many committees with government and has been so actively involved in patient safety. And one of the key handful of people that actually helped bring the HACS, the hospital-acquired conditions work, into being with CMS. So Jennifer, please give us the view and the voice of the patient as we start off and get our hearts and our minds set on the right priorities.
Thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited about today's webinar. There's so much to learn. We can never stop learning. I just want to encourage everyone here to share your information that you're learning here today. And once the recordings are available, please share them widely and encourage and invite other colleagues to come to these webinars. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll hand it back to you, Dr. Denham.
Thank you, Jenny, and we'll look forward to you as a formal reactor as well. I am going to move very quickly through what's been in the news in our webinar survey so we can get to David Marx' presentation, which is the most valuable piece. However, I'd be remiss if we didn't follow up on the issue of the active shooter events, and we have a slide number 13 to kind of focus on that. We will come back to that as we talk about our surveys and what has happened over the last 90 days. However, I'd like to address something that just came on the grid this week. ECRI, and we all know them to be a terrific organization, has identified its top 10 patient safety concerns for 2018. And interestingly, we have webinars upcoming for you that tackle a number of them already. Diagnostic errors, number one, opioid safety across the continuum, which we focused on with our MedTech program. We'll be covering both diagnostic errors and opioid safety with mortality reviews, which will be led by Gene Huddleston, the pioneer of that movement. And if you go to item 7, all hazards emergency preparedness is also an overlap with the MedTech initiative that we've been undertaking, and then leadership engagement and patient safety. So you can see that a number of these topics are important. In addition to internal coordination, workarounds, incorporating IT into safety systems, behavioral health, device cleaning and disinfection still ends up on the list, and patient engagement and literacy. Also want to draw your attention to an article that popped on the grid on the 10th. That was this week with Modern Healthcare. The data points on medical errors. It's a survey by the IHI and the National Patient Safety Foundation, Lucian Leap Institute, and University of Chicago. Significant survey, and there'll be links and content regarding this issue showing that this is still, that patient safety is really a critical issue in the latest numbers. Again, so that we can move to David Marx, I won't get into the detail. Also, the issue of the EHR problems that the government has been facing, and so we all are facing these same EHR issues, which we'll probably be addressing in 3 to 4 months. And the VA has taken a lot of punishment in the press. HIMSS, the 2018 Leadership and Workforce Survey, want to draw your attention so that you with your teams can help people understand that providers on average still rate patient safety as their top priority, followed by privacy, security, cybersecurity, etc. So we still have the attention of frontline organizations in the IT area as patient safety is a number one concern. Again, a significant survey of 369 organizations. Another survey by AMA, and again, we'll have the links to these as well as the full copies of the surveys and the reports on the web page that you can go back to when you want to view the webinar again. And for those that are in enduring content, they're available there. Cyber attacks, again, a critical issue, and the areas of these problems are addressed on slide number 18. I won't read them, but I think it really reflects that we have a critical patient safety issue that is absolutely vital. Now, investigative journalism has been on the rise with the internet, and one article that popped on the grid is the one about physicians running into patient safety problems, having disciplinary actions, and then moving to other states. So take a look at slide 19. The Milwaukee Journal Sentinel addresses a study of 500 physicians that have moved. Another issue that popped on the grid this week was the fact that we have addressed before the fabrication, falsification, and fraud that is just rampant in our medical journals, which really threatens the very basis of our evidence-based medicine approach. And unfortunately, the pressures that be have stopped Beale's list, which was the list of predatory journals. And just want to draw your attention again to the very funny story that Arthur Kaplan addressed in a fabulous article. We have it posted on the website for you. The problem with publication pollution and how it can really harm our very fragile science and evidence-based medicine approach that we take. And he cited the article Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, which was a Harvard researcher's approach to show how bad the journals really were. He created a completely nonsensical article that looked like it had something to do with oncology. Every sentence was nonsensical. He had a nonsensical software device that generated sentences that appeared to be real but were completely bogus. And 17 of 37 journals he submitted it to accepted it for publication, which shows that we really have a problem there. Shifting gears back to the MedTech program, which we've been addressing in each one of our webinars, focused on the leading causes of death to children, college students, and those in workforce years. These are a preventable death. Wanted to remind you of the Stop the Bleed program. We had a terrific response by you in our last survey last month and the month before, and to remind you, for those that are fresh to the webinar, to go to bleedingcontrol.org. This is sponsored by the Committee on Trauma, the Hartford Consensus meeting groups, the American College of Surgeons. Dr. Boats, who will speak later, is an instructor, as am I, for this program to focus on Stop the Bleed. It ties back to these school shootings and really major trauma. And we just want to draw your attention to it. See if you can start a program, see who's available there. And in the last webinar, we addressed the what if we had an AED and a Stop the Bleed kit 1 minute away from any victim. This is a bogus school. It looks like a school. It isn't a real one. But with that kind of a footprint, where would you put your Stop the Bleed kits, and what would have happened in Florida? Could that have had an impact? So now I'm moving from the news to our survey from last month, and we asked, would you like more information on the Stop the Bleed program? 61% of you agreed, 40% strongly. We will be following up with more information on this, on how to be able to start a MedTech program in your community that has as part of it the full Stop the Bleed program. We haven't duplicated anything. What we've done is said, take the Stop the Bleed training, and this will contribute to your MedTech certificate, as will the Heart Saver AHA program for CPR. I won't read through on slide 27, but we had a lot of great comments from the audience, which confirmed the interest. And slide 28 shows how you find a trainer for Stop the Bleed in your community near you on this website. And again, most, if not all, of these programs deliver this training entirely for free. We asked the question in our survey, do you want information on insider and outsider threats, all-cause insider and outsider threats? And Chief Adcox, this is really for you as a pioneer of threat safety science. We had a significant response, again, more of a bell curve. Sometimes we have everybody giving it a 10, but not everybody did. But we see 68% agree. We know who you are, and we will continue to address those issues. When we ask you what specifics you want on insider-outsider threats, they range from all kinds of threats, from cybersecurity to different programs that might be brought forth, root cause analysis, sharing what is done globally. So now for my introduction to David Marx, who's coming back. In our webinar in February, David and Sandra Colita and Ellen Forster did an absolutely spectacular job of addressing the view from the front line. They did it just a terrific job. We recommend that would be a webinar to watch in companionship with this webinar today, which is drilling down on case studies. They did a terrific job covering the view from the front line. David addressed on slide 32, 33, and 34 implementation of just culture, and the topic and all of the topics that he covered were absolutely terrific. He addressed 10 of them. He addressed culture, just culture light versus just culture, and we put these two slides in to remind you to go back. So we ask you as an audience, do you want more just culture implementation? We got 93% of you agreed, 37% gave it a 10, with 55% strongly or very strongly agreed, and that's what we're responding to now. You gave us topics that you wanted us to cover. Some will be covered today, Some will be covered in future webinars, and that's on slide 36. We ask, do you want just culture case studies? We got a whopping 54% of you gave it a 10. This webinar is for you. And as you can see from slide number 37, very strong response on just culture case studies and walking through them. A number of the topics are on slide 38. Again, I won't read them. We're going to move very directly to David Marx. Slide 39. Read them, and you'll see that your colleagues are having the same challenges you are in this issue, and that the case studies really can give us a great view of this. Now, the other question we asked was, what do you want information of what to do after a patient safety incident? 86% of you agreed, 44% gave it a 10, 21% gave it a 9. And so you'll see the case studies today, some of them are patient safety incidents, some of them are administrative issues as well. And on slide 41, you provided more information that you wanted us to cover to see. And a couple of the topics were the second victim. You can see the second victim was covered 2 or 3 times, and you'll see that in the cases. So what a joy it is to have David Marx back. He is a pioneer and leader of the Just Culture movement. He is with formal training as an engineer, as an attorney. We discussed with the other speakers that he's also done sabbatical time and worked directly with major cancer centers, and has really, I think, created now a global movement to help us understand how we can practically take the concept of just culture, bring it live, and be able to implement it in organizations. And so, David, with that introduction, you really need no introduction. I think people all know you to be the pioneer of this, but I know you to be a very dedicated and genuine person who's always seeking to really have the greatest impact on organizations and our patients and families. And we're so grateful that you've taken the time today with these case studies.
Well, thank you so much, Chuck. It's an honor to be on this third time. And like you said, we received feedback about case studies and about sort of learning about the algorithms that are out there to deal with things when things don't go as planned. And you're right, we are trying to be a global movement. We actually just taught a class in Denver this last week to a group of zoos about how to keep zoos safe for zookeepers and for the animals, and how to deal with accountability of employees in zoos. So it's amazing to places that Just Culture takes. So we're going to do some impact case studies today, and Chuck and I are going to walk you through these. We're going to take you into the algorithms and let you see how they play out. And give you a taste of what Just Culture looks like to some extent at the algorithmic level, looking at the individual scenarios. From the last session, I just wanted to come back and refresh this. At a very high level, we said 3 behaviors, actually a 4th and a 5th we'll see in the algorithms, but human error, at risk, and reckless. Human error is the thing I never intended to do. The model says, well, console that or accept the fact that we're inescapably fallible human beings. At-risk behavior is the corners I cut still thinking I'm in a safe place, whether it's not signaling a lane change, not texting while driving, perhaps not doing 2 patient identifiers going into a patient's room. There's a lot of at-risk behaviors that exist in workplaces and in life as a whole. And then the reckless behavior and above is sort of where we draw that line to say reckless is I saw the risk, I chose to do it anyway. And given that is the state of it, we think about sanction, we consider punitive action for reckless and above. Those are the 3 behaviors. And what we say is do this all independent of outcome. It's not about the tragedy or triumph of the outcome. It's about each individual being accountable for the quality of their actions.
So the 3 duties that he's addressing are the duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm, the duty to produce an outcome, and the duty to follow a procedural rule. Kyle, please give me the control, and we'll keep going until David logs back on. Maybe you can call in on an outside line. Go ahead. And so the procedural how-to breaches David has addressed. The Just Culture algorithm is well known to so many of you, and we just want to remind you to be respectful of the copyright of Outcome Ingenuity and go to their website to access them. And please don't share them with others, but we've shared them with you in a PDF slide deck in the forum. What David is saying is the algorithm is to be used after the investigation is complete, and both systems and behavioral issues have been identified. So it should be used after the investigation and when both systems and behavioral issues are addressed. So the procedural how-to breaches that he's brought up, the duty to follow a procedural rule. This path applies to when an employee works within a system and is responsible for being a reliable component within that system. And the question is, was the duty to allow a rule known to the employee? Was it possible to follow the rule, yes or no? Investigate the circumstances that led to failure to know of the duty. Was it possible to follow? If no, investigate the circumstances. Did the employee knowingly violate the rule? If no, console the employee and conduct human error investigation. If they did violate the rule, did social benefit of the breach exceed the risk? Yes. Support the employee for the decision to violate the rule. If no, decide, did the employee have a good faith but mistaken belief that the violation was insignificant or justified? If yes, at-risk behavior, coach the employee and conduct an at-risk behavior investigation.
Just one, the housekeeping worker. This event is about a housekeeping worker who doesn't put out the sign and believes he's alone and ends up having an event where somebody slips him on the floor. It's a procedural expectation that you put out a sign each and every time this occurs, and he didn't put out the sign in this particular case, thinking he's probably in a safe place. If we go into the individual algorithm, the duty to follow procedural rule, this is what the algorithm reads. The first question and the first two are really about, was it possible, and did I know the rule? Was it possible? Procedural expectations are articulated to employees. So did I know of the rule? If I don't know of the rule, I've got to figure out why the person didn't know the procedural rule. If I knew of the rule, was it possible to follow the rule? And that gets us to the sort of the starting point. And then the next question is, did the employee knowingly violate the rule? If the answer is no, it's a human error, and we console and say, sorry, this was a human error. Let's try to figure out why the human error occurred. And what I want to reinforce is these you do after the investigation has occurred. So you investigate the event, you learn from the event, then you walk through any breaches of duty that the employee has engaged in. You walk through the algorithm. The algorithm is meant to be a tool that always works in every circumstance based upon the nature of the type of duty, whether it's the values-based duty, the higher duty, the procedural duty, or the outcome-based duty. The social benefit, did the employee knowingly violate the rule? In our case, we're going to say yes, right? He didn't put out the sign. The next one, did the social benefit exceed the risk? That is this a good breach? One of the things that you have to consider in justice systems is it a values-based justice system or a rule-based? One of my mentors, Jim Reason, has a unsafe acts algorithm that many people are familiar with, but he gets to this question of, and he's British to explain this, he gets to this question of, was the procedure workable, was it correct? And if it was, then you're expected to follow it. This algorithm set that we put forward is a inherently American version, perhaps, but it says that rules are subordinate to values. And if the value says to do one thing, our rule says to do the other, you go with the values. And so the issue here is does the social benefit, was this a good breach? And we'll see a scenario where it was a good breach. We don't think not putting out the signs, that's probably not a good breach. Then the next question is, did the employee have a good faith but mistaken belief the violation was insignificant or justified? And that's the place you have to say, do I think this person not putting out the signs, do I believe that he thought he was in a safe place? And most people going through this scenario, and I've gone through this with thousands of people, most people will say, yeah, I think he thought he was in a safe place. It was late at night. There's nobody on the floor. So the model says coach the employee. Doesn't mean he's off the hook. Coaching is simply the conversation about there's probably a better way to do this, and how do we get the signs available to you? How do we make sure that you always put out a sign if you're going to wash the floors? And so the basic model is coach the employee. It's a prescriptive path, the algorithm is, It's the protocol, so to speak, to make sure as a manager that the manager's following the tenets of just culture each and every time they evaluate the conduct of an employee. The next one, scenario number 2, an engineering department has a large book in which instructions for repairing equipment are located. Policy requires the instructions be followed each time the repair was performed. Last week, a technician made a mistake on the repair of an infusion pump by omitting a required check upon reassembly of the pump. He relied on his memory to perform the task. The check called out in the manual would have confirmed the infusion pump would not allow free, unregulated flow of medication under particular failure mode of the pump. So we have a choice to do this by memory and what looks like an error, and you'll see this in the algorithm. What's added here at the bottom, an inoperable pump was caught when a patient received the free flow of heparin leading to death of the patient. An investigation reveals that technicians were regularly performing the specific maintenance, and they were performing it by memory without the aid of the procedural manual as required. So here we are in a procedural breach, which is pull out the manual and use the manual, and then make sure you hit every item in it as you're going through the task. Now, at the bottom of this, that inoperable safety pump, that particular piece of it is what we teach is that's important for the patient, obviously, because this led to the death of the patient. But relative to justice, it's not relevant to the justice piece. I know it sounds odd, but what we're judging really is the conduct of the employee. Whether a patient got harmed or not is really is a separate matter. That's sort of the luck or fortuity piece of this. And what the scenario shows that technicians were regularly doing this. And really, what you do with this technician is really what you should be doing with all the other technicians who were skipping the procedure and doing this manually. So let's go to the algorithm here. And actually, there's two things that ultimately get circled here. Because in both of the cases, did he know of the duty to pull out the manual and use it? Yes. Was the duty to follow the rule known? Yes. Was it possible? Yes. So, but in one case, he skipped an item in the check. Didn't mean to skip that item. So did he knowingly violate that aspect of the rule to do each and every item? The answer is no. That was the human error. Of course, we're going to say to this employee, the reason we want you to pull out the manual and use it and not do your memory is because doing this by memory, you're more susceptible to the human error. The decision he made, though, the choice he made to do this by memory, that was a choice. So did he knowingly violate that rule? The answer is probably yes. Did the social benefit exceed the risk? This wasn't a good breach to do this by memory. And then the next one, did the employee have a good faith but mistaken belief the violation was insignificant or justified? And then we would be back to the answer is being yes. And then we would coach the employee. We'd do the at-risk behavior investigation. Again, the algorithms are post-event investigation. You just use these to make sure that any action we take, particularly that's potentially adverse to the employee, that we have a structured process. Because without a structured process, we just fall back to how was the outcome and who did it. And that doesn't serve anybody in the process. The next scenario, a brand new nurse to the OR who's watching the learning processes of her new employer storms out of the safety timeout ahead of surgery right into the director of the OR's office. She blurts out, "Are you kidding me?" And what she's frustrated with, the anesthesiologist is listening to his iPod with those little things in his ears. He's actually dancing a bit, moving to the beat, nodding his head. And so she's complaining to the director of the OR that they look like zombies, and we're sitting there going through a surgical timeout with the anesthesiologist not really participating in the timeout. And asks, very adamant here, asks the director of the OR, do anesthesiologists get a pass? Does anyone really care? And this is an interesting one culturally because most institutions today look into this and say, well, yeah, we wouldn't allow that in our culture. There are others that would look into this and say, no, this really is our culture. We'd sort of passively participate in the timeouts. We know it's the rule, but we're not, depending on the type of surgery, we're just not so participative. So if we go through the algorithm, and what really actually, if you judge in this particular case, you're looking at the conduct of the anesthesiologist with the earbuds in, but you're also looking at the conduct of the surgeon who continues with the timeout while we're all staring at the anesthesiologist with the earbuds in the ears. You're looking at the conduct of the scrub and the circulator. You're looking at the conduct of the director of the OR who seemingly is turning a blind eye to it. So if we go through this and say, let's take a look at the anesthesiologist with the earbuds, we got a timeout. There's a particular way we expect you to participate in the timeout. So the first question is, did we know the rule? They did. Was it possible? Yes. Did the employee knowingly violate the rule? All right. Does he know he's not participating in the way he should? Probably yes. Did the social benefit exceed the risk? This wasn't a good breach. The answer is no. So now, did the employee have a good faith but mistaken belief that the violation was insignificant or justified? And this is the issue. This question right here is not there's not a universal answer for operating rooms across the world or across America. There is what is relevant in your culture. So there are those that would say looks like an at-risk behavior. Why does it look like an at-risk behavior? Why do we think that the anesthesiologist thought he was in a safe place? Because it looks like everybody else was tolerating that behavior. Not only the team, but probably the leadership of the OR was tolerating that behavior. Then you would say it's at risk. It doesn't mean anesthesiologist gets off the hook. We're going to coach the anesthesiologist. We're going to say we need you to conform your behaviors to what we expect in a timeout. If you can't conform your behaviors, then maybe this isn't the right place for you to have privileges. All right. Others, and Alan Frankel, who I've co-taught this with a number of times, Alan's like, no, this is reckless. This is totally reckless. And if it is reckless in Alan's culture, then so be it. It's reckless. But if it was reckless, the issue is you probably wouldn't have team members support the behavior. Generally, when we see reckless behavior among each other, we're willing to call it out. I don't know. So Chuck, in your history, do you think it's at risk or do you think it's reckless to participate in the timeout with earbuds in the ear?
Well, having been trained as a jet pilot as well as a radiation oncologist, and I subspecialized in the OR, I would say that practically speaking, there's a lot of parallel processing that goes on in the cockpit. But if an instructor pilot was sitting in the cockpit with two Southwest Airlines pilots, you would not have somebody doing something that wasn't paying 100% attention to the checklist process.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because in a cockpit, you're right. If the co-pilot had his earbuds in and they're all sitting there, the process would stop. It probably would not go on and be tolerated, just peer-to-peer tolerated. But in this particular case, if it looked like the rest of the team was tolerating the behavior, it looks like this this new nurse moved into what was an unhealthy culture, one that tolerated the behavior, in this case, of the anesthesiologist, to actually do something that was risky and everybody else turning a blind eye. It's not that it's right. It's not that it's aspirational by any sense of the word. It's just that it is the reality of this particular place where this brand new nurse hired onto. Was it a reckless choice? Well, it's probably not reckless in their culture. Is it the right choice? No. How do you? And really, this event really speaks to the director of the OR. What kind of culture has the director of the OR, the head of the surgical services? What kind of culture to be created that allows this kind of conduct to exist, unchecked, even peer to peer?
And I want to get to the other scenarios, but I just remind us of the Northwest pilots who said that they were working on their computer and overflew Minneapolis by 150 miles. Whatever was going on, which could have been one of them napping and then the other guy fell asleep, or there were all kinds of hypotheses, but not following strictly the protocols, the numbers will catch up with you.
Yeah, that's right, and it's interesting, and part of this has to do with the phase, right? The phase. If you're in the pre-flight, nobody's fallen asleep, but there's been more than one circumstance in the U.S. where air traffic control had to wake up the pilots because they'd fallen asleep crossing the country. So at some point where you get a dark cockpit philosophy and you're midway on the flight, you're letting the machine just fly and you're just monitoring. And it's the same kind of issues that anesthesiologists might have while they're sitting there through a long surgery and does the anesthesiologist doze off. This next scenario is a nursing manager. This is a very interesting one from a just culture perspective. A nursing manager walks by a patient's room, sees the patient about to fall from his bed. She quickly runs to bedside, lifting the patient back onto the bed before the patient actually falls. In doing so, the nurse manager failed to follow hand hygiene rules, which said you have to wash hands for 15 seconds before you get in and touch the patient. The event came to light when a disgruntled nurse filed a risk report on the nurse manager. Now, this is a procedural breach. It is a breach. The rule says wash your hands when you go in to see the patient. In this case, if we go through the algorithm, was the duty to follow the rule known to the employee? Yes. Was it possible? Possible in this kind of context is, was it literally possible? And the answer is yes. Was it the right thing to do is a different question. Did the employee knowingly violate the rule? Yes. Did the social benefit exceed the risk? Was this the right breach? And this is where the answer is yes. It comes out and says, yes, this is the right thing to do. This is a scenario where values trump rules, right? If the patient is about to fall out of the bed and I have a procedural rule that says I have to wash hands going into the room, but our values are to protect the safety of the patient, a nurse, and I've done this in a number of nursing peer reviews, nursing peer review will quickly say, no, the right thing to do is to give aid. Now, if the patient has Ebola, then we're having a different discussion. But on a general med surg floor, a patient's beginning to slip out of the bed, you run and grab the patient. Had it gone actually the other way, had the nurse said, cling to the sheets, give me 15 seconds while I wash my hands, and followed the procedural rule, most nurses in a peer review would say, well, that's the reckless choice. It's reckless to sit there and tell the patient to cling to the sheets while they're slowly slipping off the bed just because we got to wash hands. And the point of this is in life and for a justice system to really be fair, it has to have the notions of justifiable breach. It has to say, even though I have a rule, we're not so good as rule makers as we can be perfect in that our rule applies to every practice. It doesn't. The rule is sort of the normal. But if the circumstances in hand say the right thing to do is A, and the rule says do B, then you do A. And it's a values-based system of justice. And I put this out there because not all algorithms are going to be the same. This algorithm is supportive of what's called the values-based system of justice, and to some extent, this, by the way, is embedded in American criminal law. Even if you trespass and it's the right thing to do, we'll support you in trespassing. All right, this is one of the scenarios, Chuck, that you had put in, and I'll just read through it. A physician leader at a major medical center had a significant primary clinical duties, also led an educational service. She was presented with a negative performance review regarding that service by the administrator responsible for the operation of the educational service. This was presented without adhering to the written policy. There's a procedural rule of having her review it before it was sent to her clinical chairman, who was her boss. The negative review is used as a rationale to shut down most of the educational services because cut costs. It appeared the physician leader that the negative performance review of her work was used to justify reduction of expenses, and you can see where it plays out. So here is a physician leader who feels like there was an injustice done, the procedural rules breached, didn't have a chance to review, and actually believes there's some ulterior motive behind performance review. Now, what I'm looking at here is the procedural piece of this, and that is didn't review it with her before sending it to her boss. If I go in the algorithm, and it's interesting, you'll see I have three things circled here, and this is an interesting one because Chuck, you had written this, and you had some sense of evil in the leader that's doing the review here. But if you look at the fact pattern, and it says didn't do the review, what we have to figure out is why they didn't do the review, right? So I want you to be open as we go through this. Was the rule to do the review known? Yes. Was it possible to do the review? We're assuming yes. Did the employee, the manager, did they knowingly violate the rule? And so the issue here is you could see all three behaviors: human error, at risk, and reckless. what you have to get back to is, why was the review with the employee not conducted? Was it simply an oversight, or was it something much more tragic, like I'm trying to submarine this employee and the service that she runs? So until you get to that place and do the event investigation, but this is to some extent what we have in patient safety events, where the patient's family's looking in and saying, well, wait a second, you caused harm to me, and very emotional about it. But the issue is, as an institution, we've got to go back and say, well, yeah, we did cause harm to the patient or a family member, but was that harm the result of human error? Was it at risk? Was it reckless? And then only until you know those, or only until you know the facts, can you really go through and answer all the questions. That's why I had human error, at risk, and reckless circle here, because technically on the fact pattern we have right now, we don't know until we finish the investigation. Although I think, Chuck, you were thinking it was more than a reckless violation here.
Yeah, and I think that what this illustrates at least the example of how some short-term. So let's say it's not to maliciously harm the employee, the physician leader at all. However, the mid-level or upper-level administrative manager is told, you've got to cut your expenses by 10%. I don't care how you do it, but you have to get it done. And they're left with the dilemma of what they do. And the easiest thing is to have a justifiable reason to cut the expense for the department without having any malicious intent on the clinical leader. However, not realizing the long-term ramification of programmatic advancement, tenure, and bonus, it seemed like a short-term thing to kind of, well, we've got no margin, no mission, and it was an easier way of shutting down that service with no malicious intent toward the employee, but the long-term ramifications are much more serious than perhaps the employee, the mid-level manager, realized.
And it's important as you go through, you think about just culture, is we look at outcomes, we look at the outcome, particularly this employee is looking at their own personal outcomes, saying, wow, this isn't good. Now the issue is to really be just, we have to get back, and we do this what the law calls an objective standard. As a peer review team, we would look in and say, look, what was going on in the mind of the person doing the review, the performance review here? What level of intention they had? Because you used the words, no malice, perhaps. Did they know that harm was going to occur? So you're assessing what is the intentions of the human being involved. All right, so those are the procedural breaches. So one of the algorithms is the procedural duties, and these are the duties to say, we're going to tell employees how to do this. And you'll see human error, at risk, and reckless in there, and you'll see justifiable breach. But all those will sort of appear in the procedural duties when the duty, in the procedural breach is when the duty is procedural. That is a how-to. The more interesting ones, generally for most people, are the values-based, don't do breaches. This is where we have breaches even in the absence of any particular rule. And I think to do just culture right is you have to move beyond simply did the employee follow the rule to did the employee do the right thing, or did the employee knowingly cause harm. So we call this the duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm. And we ask a different series of questions. We ask the first one, was it the employee's purpose to cause harm? The highest level of culpability we can have is the express goal of causing harm to another human being, and we do have those, whether it's the shooter in the Florida school. Was it the employee's purpose to cause harm? We see employees with a purpose to cause harm. If the answer is no, did the employee knowingly cause harm? Knowingly causing harm is, it's not my intention, but I knew it was going to happen anyway. And generally like a breach of privacy. To go into George Clooney's medical record is to knowingly cause harm to George Clooney in the breach of privacy. So we ask the question, did they knowingly cause harm? If the answer is yes, we ask the question of, was the harm justified as the lesser of two evils? It's never okay to have the purpose of causing harm, but it is okay sometimes to knowingly cause harm, and that is if it's justified as lesser of two evils. And you'll see police officers who have to restrain or have to cause harm in order to avoid a larger harm. So we do have places where harm is justified as the lesser two evils, and we ask that question around the case of knowingly. Beyond knowingly, now up on the third box on the right, on the top, did the behavior represent a substantial and justifiable risk? So what you're asking here is you're looking at conduct and saying, what is the harm? So, the terminology of, patient circling the drain being used in front of a patient, not a very good thing to do. Is there a rule against it? Well, nobody's even thinking about writing a rule. But is it not aligned with our values? The answer is yes, it's not aligned with our values. Nobody's supposed to refer to a patient as circling the drain. It's a terrible thing to do. And so what is the harm? Well, it's going to upset the patient. It's going to upset the family members. And then you'd ask the question, okay, what's your level of intention toward that harm? And that's what we ask in this algorithm. So did the behavior represent a substantial and unjustifiable risk? If the answer is yes. Did the employee consciously disregard the substantial and unjustifiable risk? This is the legal definition, in fact, of recklessness. And recklessness in the algorithm is recklessness, what we know on the street. It's knowingly putting others in harm's way. If the answer is no, the answer is, well, then should the employee have known they were taking a substantial and unjustifiable risk? This gets us to the human error net risk, where I did not think I was taking a substantial and unjustifiable risk, but I should have. If the answer is I had no reason to know, maybe a chemotherapy bag with the wrong agent's, drug inside the bag, but the nurse has no idea really what's inside the bag. They only know what's on the label. Then you can say they even have no reason to know, because a nurse really can't confirm what's inside the bag. They can only confirm what's on the label. Should the employee have known they were taking a substantial and justifiable risk? If the answer is yes, did they choose the behavior? If they chose it, it's at risk. If the answer is no, then we say human error console. So the same algorithm, it walks you through 5 levels, really, of culpability: purpose, knowledge, recklessness, and actually negligence. But negligence is really replaced in this model with at-risk and human error, because negligence, again, on the streets is much more culpable than it is really in a legal sense. So that's the second algorithm here. We're going to, the next scenario is we're going to go through this algorithm. So at scenario 6, a nurse arrives at the patient's bed with 2 syringes in her pocket. One was prepared by the nurse at the central nurses station. It had no patient name or medication label on it. The second syringe also did not have a label, and the nurse did not know where it came from. So she's in the room. She's now got a second syringe. She didn't know where it came from. She guessed she must have also picked it up by mistake from the central nurses station. Knowing that she just prepared a medication with 2 milliliters of the drug, and the second unknown syringe only had 1.5, she decided to use the unmarked syringe having 2 milliliters of drug. Now, you would look into this and you could say, well, I might find some procedural breaches, but you can also see things as a provider that is not aligned with our shared values of patient safety. One of those is walking away from a central nurses station with an unlabeled syringe. And it's interesting because there were times when, a more senior nurse could say, that's exactly what I used to do. We're trying to shift that culture, right, to where you just don't walk away from a nurse. If it's short of exigent circumstances like a code, if you're going to walk away from that central nurses station, you generally are supposed to have a label on the syringe for this same type of reason. The second one is getting to bedside, seeing you have 2 syringes in your hand. What's the right thing to do? Setting a policy aside, what's the right thing to do? The right thing to do is to trash them both, discard them both, and start over. But in this case, the nurse says, well, I pulled 2. This one has 2, although we know there can be some leakage even in a pocket. The issue is how do I sort of deal with this? The right thing to do is to waste them and start over. So if I go through the algorithm at this one, this is looking at, does this conduct, and this duty really looks at conduct. Is the conduct here not aligned with our shared values? So the first question, was it employee's purpose to cause harm? The answer is no. Did the employee knowingly cause harm? Well, it's 50-50 chance. Knowingly here means practically certain to occur. The answer is no. Did the behavior represent a substantial and unjustifiable risk? The answer is yes. To gamble, to choose between the two, the answer would be yes. Did the employee consciously disregard the substantial and unjustifiable risk? And you guys on the call, you could be the peer review. Would a nurse have to consciously disregard what she sees as a substantial and unjustifiable risk in order to engage in this conduct? And most people will go to that question and say the answer is yes. You can't have 2 unlabeled syringes in your hand, not know which is the one for your patient, and simply guess that this is the right one. And this is where a nursing or peer review would say, okay, this is a reckless behavior, and we would consider a punitive sanction in this particular circumstance. All right, scenario 7. A root cause analysis is undertaken after a patient dies of sepsis. When the RCA when the RCA did not address the many hours of lacking responsiveness of the attending physician to calls by the nursing staff regarding the deteriorating patient and the lack of action when she was reached, one of the nurses brought these issues up for discussion in the RCA. In the weeks that followed, the nurse was presented with what appeared to be a fabricated performance improvement plan by his nursing supervisor and director of HR. It was clear that this document was fabricated with damaging and inaccurate information post-dated for prior actions. He had never seen it before, and the written policy stated that such reviews should have been reviewed by the organization. He had the clear impression that the organization was weaponizing the HR department to quiet him or to get him to leave. So the issue here is an altered performance review based upon somebody being outspoken in the RCA. All right, if you go into duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm, was it the employee's purpose to cause harm? Chuck, what do you think?
Well, if we're talking about the employee, the HR employee or the leader, is that the person that you're going through, or the nurse? I would think it would be the HR leader. Yeah.
Yeah, the HR leader.
Yeah, I would say that it was that it was to intentionally cause harm or the threat of harm in order to get the nurse to back off. Yeah, it's interesting because part of this too, you might look at this and it doesn't change the answer here, but you could say it was to minimize harm because you didn't want any blowback from the doc, and so if we have a nurse who's pushing issues and we want to get the nurse to stop to try to reduce the harm and try to pacify the doctor, you might answer no. The employee's purpose wasn't to cause harm; it was to avoid harm, because this was sort of conflict avoidance. Rather than take on the physician, it was to quiet the nurse, right? Then the second one is, did the employee knowingly cause harm? Well, obviously, knowingly causing harm to the nurse. Was the harm justified as the lesser of two evils? You'd have no. So whether you conclude it was the purpose to cause harm or simply knowingly cause harm, both get you to the same answer, which is the punitive sanction. And again, all of these cases are real cases that have been modified so they're unidentifiable. But these are real. This is a real case, and so I think the algorithm makes a lot of sense. And the weaponization of HR in order for short-term the short-term lack of damage to the organization, but will have long-term damage to the individual, the nurse, the doctor, the patient, the family that might be discredited heading towards a lawsuit. So I think the algorithm is excellent as it's applied to this.
Yeah, and Chuck, we talked about, I think on the last session is that, from a patient safety perspective, we're principally looking at human errors, generally at-risk behaviors. But if you put on your HR hat and you look at all the conduct that an organization has to face, I've talked to big box retailer where half of all theft is from employees. We have employees that engage in harassment. We'll see, employees that will doctor research results. We'll have employees that will do a performance review in the wrong way in order to cause harm. So we really do have the full scale of the full spectrum of human behavior. And for just culture to work well, as a human resource leader, you have to say, I have to deal with everything from a mere mistake all the way up to a purpose to cause harm. And that's what these algorithms are intended to do. They're intended to really address all conduct. So they're not a patient safety tool in the sense of how do we deal with something nobody intended to do. But in this particular case, we have much more culpable behavior, but we still want to make sure we're doing justice the right way. And if we're going to make a commitment to our employees about here's how you'll be treated, then you have to be able to say, we go through the algorithm each time, we document it. Anytime it's adverse to the employee, in order to protect the culture, to protect the learning culture, anytime it's adverse to the employee, we go through the algorithm, we document it, and we make sure that each and every time we followed a strict process to make sure that we're reliable as the reviewers. Otherwise, again, it falls back to how bad was the outcome, who did it, or just, what do we happen to think on this day. We try to take the emotion out of it and make it a very objective exercise.
Which I think is excellent, and I think, as you'll hear from John Nance a little later, your just culture algorithms really should apply to the board, to the top administrative leaders, upper, mid, and lower level leadership that are non-clinical and not professional caregivers. And I think some people think just culture, that just applies to med airs with nurses and doctors and wrong site surgery. But I think you've demonstrated beautifully how it can apply to everybody.
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's not, we've been doing this for 20 years. There's not a place the algorithm doesn't work. And you think about this, CEO duties are just different duties than a nurse on the floor. But CEOs can engage in conduct that's not aligned with our values. They can engage in procedural breaches. They cannot produce outcomes they're supposed to produce. So the duties are the same, the nature of the duties, just what the task is of being a CEO, being a board member, being the director of nursing. Just the obligations are different, and we just deal with breach in the same way using the same tools. So scenario 8, this one I know is, Chuck, you had a particular interest in. Physician A and B, two physicians from different institutions are undertaking collaborative research and co-authoring a paper together. Physician A publishes a peer-reviewed article to specifically discredit physician B. The article is fraught with verifiable fabrication and falsification of information about her. Careful scrutiny reveals the article as a public sham peer review of physician B. Physician A did not declare his conflicts of interest prior to work with physician B and what funding he had gained from working with physician B, or what he could gain from the article. Physician A is rewarded by assuming positions he once held by physician B. So what we have is one physician fabricating and falsifying information about another. This goes back to some extent of who we are as human beings. So occasionally our inherent self-interest comes out. And in this particular case, physician A was doing things that were just not appropriate. So if we look at the potential harm here, this is actually harming specifically physician B. The conduct that we're looking at is the fabrication and falsification of information about her. So we go through the algorithm again. Was it the employee's purpose to cause harm? This is an interesting thing about purpose, because purpose is, what is your goal? The goal of physician A was just to really feather A's nest, right? If he could do it without causing harm to B, he probably would. But in order to get where he wanted to be, he had to cause harm to physician B. So again, either answer, you just have to, purpose is, was it my express goal to cause harm? Because he could say, look, I don't like this person, I want this person gone or discredited, or am I just doing this for my own purpose, my own pursuit of happiness? If the answer is that, you would say, well, it's not purposely causing harm. Was it knowingly causing harm? Absolutely. Justifies a less than trivial? No way. Then you get to consider punitive action. Purpose to cause harm is murder. It's things where my sort of goal was to cause harm to another human being. But again, it's on the left-hand side of the algorithm. It's pretty highly culpable behavior, and I think, Chuck, it's probably what you had written into the scenario.
Right, and what I wanted to do is we have interviewed Dr. Hoon Toon, who has been the leader in writing about sham peer review, which actually was studied by the AMA, and it appears to be 1 in 6 peer review initiatives done in hospitals about another physician's care. In this case, it was about research, but this really applies across the board to reviewing another's work. And it turns out that about 15% of the peer reviews in America are sham peer review, where there's a financial incentive or disincentive that is created in order to have those reviewing be able to have a benefit from presenting information that is either falsified or slanted or in some case completely fabricated. And so this is much more common than people realize, and it's also done, again, this weaponization of HR internally. So and we're hearing more and more about this, and a lot of it is unpublished, but it is there. So great, you've applied it, I think, your algorithm really well here.
Yeah, and in all these, even even though the places where we have bad outcomes, and if you talk about the topical things like today, what's happening with even the Me Too movement and harassment, you're going to have events that occur by human error. You're going to have events that are at risk, although that's sort of getting narrowed, and you're going to have events where just simply knowingly are causing harm. And the idea of the algorithm is the algorithms are meant to work for all conduct, because as a leader of the institution, you're going to see all the conduct, everywhere from human error on the patient safety end to highly self-interested behavior like this one. Okay, this one, scenario number 9, an OB nurse had to undertake back-to-back shifts during a holiday weekend when other nurses were out sick. He was very fatigued and notified his supervisor of this issue and stayed at the hospital between shifts due to concerns regarding fatigue driving home. A new barcode reader was not functional for IV bags, and data had to be entered into the system manually. A checklist had to be initiated to have the nurse load the IV pumps with epidural block medication prior to anesthesiologist arriving on the floor to undertake the procedure. The fatigued nurse made the error of accidentally beginning to administer the epidural IV, believing it was antibiotic in a look-alike fluid bag that was already ordered. Although the nurse immediately took responsibility for his error, another nurse caught the near miss and wrote him up for this potential medication adverse event. So here was a circumstance. If you look at this and say, what is the conduct we're going to judge? And there's a lot the investigation could go. There's multiple places you could look in terms of the underlying causes of why this occurred. But the piece we want to focus on here for a moment is the checklist that says we want to load the IV pumps first, even if there's not an order, but pulling and loading the IV pump so that it's really setting up the nurse to make the mistake, and then the nurse makes the mistake. So if we go through the algorithm, if we look at the conduct of giving the wrong medication to the patient, if you were going to do that and say that was the conduct I'm looking at, it clearly was not the employee's purpose to cause harm. Did they knowingly cause harm? No. Did the behavior represent a substantial and unjustifiable risk? Well, you could say yes, the behavior of giving the wrong medication. Did the employee consciously disregard this substantial and unjustifiable risk? Again, what you have to do in this algorithm, you have to look at the different elements of conduct. If the conduct is giving the wrong med, then you're going to get to no. Should the employee have known they were taking a substantial and unjustifiable risk? Yes. Did they choose the behavior, which is to give the wrong med? The answer is no. We say console the employee, conduct the human error investigation. You could also look at other conduct in this event. You could say the preloading of a drug without an order. Now, this hospital said, well, it's our procedures, we're going to have you do that. So in this case, you're probably saying, well, she's compliant. Was it a risky thing to do? You might look at the conduct and say, okay, in the conduct of the preload, was it her employee's purpose to cause harm? No. Did the employee knowingly cause harm? No. Did the behavior represent a substantial and unjustifiable risk to preload the medications? And you probably say no in this culture because it was the system they had set up. There was no expectation that they would see this as a substantial and unjustifiable risk. It actually was codified into their protocols. So you would get to do not consider any employee action because there's no real intention on the part of the employee to cause harm by preloading the IV. Anything else on that one, Chuck? If you want
because of time, I'm going to watch us here, and I will comment. I'm going to ask you after we hear from our reactors, the leadership and administrators should know that a very fatigued nurse that works back-to-back shifts at a certain point is impaired, and they don't know they're impaired because of fatigue. And then how would you play that out, being also coming from Boeing and aviation and that kind of thing? I think that in the aviation field, the airline's got to know that if you ask a pilot to fly, back-to-back long extended trips and they're so fatigued they can't drive home, whose fault is it if they make a mistake, with the gear up landing when they're totally fatigued and they had to cover for someone else? Do we blame them, or how does fatigue factor in to how well they appreciate the risk they're taking? Because once they're impaired by fatigue, there's a certain point where leadership and management's got to take over for the fatigue factor, because the person isn't aware of the risk that they're taking. But at any rate, let's keep going, and because I want to make sure to get Chief Adcox, Dr. Boats, to respond.
Yeah. And just a comment about that though. The way these algorithms work is every human being is accountable for their conduct in their role. So we see this in truck drivers, where the truck driver who pushes the limits of driving the truck and driving relative fatigue, you might look at that truck driver and say, look, you've taken unjustifiable risks. But likewise, managers who are doing the scheduling are saying, are we taking unjustifiable risk in the way that we're scheduling the truck drivers? So each have independent duties, and you could find them both to have made errors, you could find them both to be reckless, but they're independent obligations the manager has from the employee, and we judge each within the context of their job. Scenario 10, CEO of a major medical center discovers that the number of researchers who have received federal grants has fabricated and falsified certain information or applications. And I know we have the interest in time here, Chuck. This one is what
you want me to summarize it? Since this is a real case, again, blinded, and some things have been changed, so it's not recognizable. But a number of researchers have submitted data that they have that is false information. However, a careful review of it is not that they were intentionally bad actors and dishonest, although some were. The CEO had to look at every one that the whole organization undertook, and a majority of them had non-compliance to the rules that one could, being very hard, looking at it, would say, well, that's false information. But their answer is, well, this is the way we've always done it, and this is the way we've been told to do it. And there was a small group of egregious acts that were clearly intentional acts of fraud. But now the CEO is left with a whole host of federal contracts and federal grants for which much of the information is inaccurate. Was it intentional? Yes, but was it part of the way we do things? And this is the way you always calculate it, even though a typical researcher can't have 200% time, right? They're allocating more time to different things because that's the way they've always done it. So it was a normalization of deviance, of relatively unintentional fraud with a small group of really bad actors.
And if we go through the algorithm, again, the self-interest of the researchers, their purpose is actually to further the research. Their purpose is financial. There's a lot of purpose, but it's really pursuit of their own happiness, and they're doing it by falsifying records along the way. So we get to knowingly causing harm, not justify as the lesser two evils. Now the institution is sort of stuck with this harm. The issue here is you are going to see all ranges of conduct here. And we say, when we talk about system design, we say design systems for self-interested behavior. And part of this is having the right checks in the system to make sure that self-interested human beings, who we all are, aren't tempted to go down the wrong path. This is why we lock up the narcotics in the hospital. And it, to some extent, would be a way, Chuck, the issue here would be, how do we lock down how we do the research so that employees don't get led astray and down the wrong path to where, because this is a human being who gets caught up in doing the wrong thing and ultimately is now falsifying records in a research program. All right, that's the duty to avoid causing unjustifiable risk or harm. Just at a high level, and we'll hand it back over to you, Chuck. There are three other pieces. I wanted to spend any time on. The third duty to produce an outcome. This is, if I have to do, 500 checked items an hour being the checker at Costco, am I able to produce the result I need to produce? This is where we say to employee, you have the job to produce a result. The system may be fixed around you, but it's a reasonable system. Can you produce sort of the minimal results that you need to produce? I wouldn't take, you don't take medication errors and things down this, but what you're taking is those outcomes that I've been tasked to produce. There is a piece in here for repetitive human error. Every organization's had the employee that's a mistake waiting to happen. It's even been me at times, and apparently today on this webinar, I was a mistake waiting to happen with my phone. The repetitive errors, how do you walk through that? And there is a path here that walks the individual who has a pronounced rate of error through the algorithm to see if there's things we can do to fix the system, or ultimately have to say to the employee, this is maybe time to take a less risky job. And there's also the repetitive at-risk behaviors piece in here. Some people look in our model and say, well, yeah, we coach, but what if they're not responsive to coaching? There is a path that ultimately, part of my obligation as employees to be responsive to coaching. If I'm not responsive to coaching, then we may go down a disciplinary path. So there are some questions that we ask about repetitive at-risk behaviors before we say, okay, maybe this isn't the right place for you to work. So I'm not off the hook for that risk behavior, but there's a bit of grace here that says, look, human beings, we're not only inescapably fallible, but we have this propensity to drift. And if we start to drift, how do I steer that employee back on the safe path? If they're unwilling to get back on that safe path, then we say maybe this isn't the right place for you to work. So with that, I will, I believe, hand it back over to you, Chuck, and to the panel. And again, I appreciate the time, and sorry for my at-risk behavior of closing my hot truck up and causing my phone to overheat and shut off on me. So again, my apologies for my error and my at-risk behavior.
David, thank you so much. And so for time, so I can give maximal time to our reactors, I just want to introduce a concept of a new project that we'll ask and we would love to have you respond to our survey. And I'm going to go to our reactors, but I'm going to have Kyle post the survey right away so that we now have a full 15 minutes for our reactors. So you're right on time, Dave. But I wanted to bring up the issue of the Innocence Project. And the Innocence Project, that most of you know, is when DNA analysis came online, a group of lawyers got together to use this new technology to be able to prove the innocence of people that may have, through the legal system, cases had been built against them. And I think what you and I said yesterday, Dave, is that when you the first day of law school, they teach you it's not about the truth, it's about the narrative of how you can focus the facts to win the game. And so their approach was to use that data. On the right is a proposed program that we're putting together, the Healthcare Innocence Project. It builds on the idea, and instead of DNA, we can now use the electronic records, both administrative and the EHR, in order to be able to help substantiate the innocence of patients and families who oftentimes are discredited after an adverse event, and caregivers after an adverse event. Not all organizations, but some will lynch somebody in the town square in order to protect the organization. And it turns out that the digital DNA in the electronic records provide enormous evidence to be able to find out the source of truth, or true source of truth, that can actually prove the innocence of caregivers, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, but also patients and families as they head down the path after an adverse event. So this idea of weaponizing HR, Sham peer review, discrediting patients and families after healthcare accidents, or just the cybersecurity issues that relate to breach of medical records. So we'd like to have you react to the following question. I'm interested in more detail on the Healthcare Innocence Project, which really ties beautifully into the just culture work of Dave Marx. And if you do, the kinds of issues that you want us to cover, and that's on slide 79. On slide 80, we want to know, do you want another webinar on just culture case studies? I have to tell you, it's been awesome working with David. I think his algorithm is terrific. I think there's a whole new vista of opportunities for administrative and boards in this area. And if you do, the second question, the free text narrative, is what scenarios do you want us to present? What are typical real-world scenarios that you'd like to have us address? And then the final question is, we have Gene Huddleston, who will be presenting mortality reviews and end-of-life opportunities for improvement. And we'd like to know, do you want that? And she's an upcoming webinar. And if you do, the opportunities for improvement of omission and commission at end of life. And now, I want to turn things over to Chief Adcox. We'll play a recorded component. I'm moving the slides a little bit here. What we'll do is we'll play John Nance after we hear from Dr. Boats. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Chief Adcox to have you react to the scenarios and the just culture principles and concepts. Chief Adcox has been a real champion. He's a pioneer of threat safety science with Greg Boats, Dr. Greg Boats. He is the Chief Security Officer and the Chief of Police of the UT Healthcare and MD Anderson Center. He's responsible actually for the caregivers and the many patients that come through the area and more than 20,000 employees. So, Chief, your thoughts about what you've heard today?
Thank you very much. First off, David Marx, again, what great work and very insightful. A few things that stand out for me is when I think about it, I know that patient safety drives quality, and that's our ultimate goal in our hospitals and in any organization. And to me, just culture is critical to patient safety. And so if we can think about it in those realms. Also, just culture, in my opinion, is moving from a punitive or a prosecutorial type approach to one based on trust, transparency, and ethics. And the other piece is that just culture, in my personal opinion, is about getting our employees' commitment to solving problems versus this real strict, disciplined, authoritative type approach. So you kind of like lastly, kind of like I see where there's this balance between, it's a complementary balance between just culture and expectations of honesty and ethics. So I think this is exactly what most organizations really should be taking on. It dovetails with getting organizations to comply with high reliability organization principles, which is what every hospital should strive for, just like the airlines industry, et cetera. So with that, I think it was a great webinar. Learned a lot personally, and I want to thank David Marx and Dr. Denham for making this possible.
Thank you, Chief. And then Dr. Greg Boats, we'd like to hear from you. Dr. Boats is a professor of the University of Texas at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. He's an ICU critical care doctor, has worked all over the world to help set up certification programs. He's also on faculty at Stanford, a medical center, frequently flies with LifeFlight, and is a fabulous educator. And it was really his inspiration, along with Chief Adcox, that led to the MedTech program that is now saving lives. Great.
Well, thanks very much, David Marx. This was a fantastic presentation that furthered the discussion of just culture in our environment. And I think the most valuable thing here was seeing real-life scenarios that we're very familiar with in our healthcare organizations, and how to apply the algorithms to get to the resolution in a safe and just and fair way for employees and for the organization itself. And I think that's been very informative, and I look forward to the opportunity to explore other scenarios that others might have in their own institutions that aren't really moving in the right direction, that this framework might help us get to a just culture resolution. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Greg. I'm going to have you. We'll have time for you to react to the folks and have a discussion here, David. Kyle, would you please play John Nant's response, and then Jenny, will go to you before we then go back to David. So, John, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's just an excellent presentation, and I love the just culture algorithm, and this is something that really does strike very close to home in terms of what I've been saying for many years. We have a tendency to simplify things, oversimplify things in medicine, and then make them the flavor of the month. And one of the things that unfortunately has been a result of this is people thinking that just culture simply means, well, we're still going to shoot you, but we're going to do it by the numbers. That's not what that's all about. And the algorithm gives you a really good tool, but here's one of the key points, and it screams at me that everybody needs to pay attention to this. When you're going through a logic tree with a real scenario, with real people, if you go into it with a prejudice already, that you've got a particular conclusion, that it was it was an advertent, a purposeful act versus anything else. If you go in with anything other than just the cold facts, you're going to skew it and go off in the wrong direction, and you're not going to be applying a just culture. It is very important to take the National Transportation Safety Board's type of mindset, that we don't go in with any preconceived notions. We put everything out on the table, and we learn from each and every incident. If at the end of the day you've got something that somebody did advertently, then that's a scenario that is very clearly requires discipline, requires termination, that sort of thing. But that algorithm is excellent, provided you go in, and I hate to say these words, but it's kind of true, with a pure heart. On the scenarios, take scenario 7, for instance. There's another aspect here that's extremely important. We're always down in the weeds talking about medication errors, talking about bedside errors, talking about errors in the OR. This type of approach, not just the algorithm, but the whole approach of just culture, applies to every person involved in healthcare, and that includes the board of directors, that includes the CEO and COO, and there are very many times that the message that the institution is trying to send to the front ranks, that we're going to be kinder and gentler, and we're going to use these algorithms, and we are going to have a just culture, gets completely destroyed because somebody at the top or somebody close to the top does something that is unaddressed, and everybody knows about it. Just one example here is weaponizing HR. The feeling that somebody doesn't like what you said, whether in an RDA or otherwise, now going to ruin your career, and that's going to be tolerated. So this is important to understand. It can't just be the front ranks or the middle ranks. It has to be everyone. Everyone is responsible for adhering to this philosophy if it's going to be workable.
So as you can tell, that John is just such a very, very thoughtful guy. And in our conversations, and he reviewed all of the scenarios and really thought that the boards of directors could really, really benefit from it. Jenny Dingman, your thoughts, and then we'll go back to David.
Thank you, Dr. Denham. Boy, what a great webinar. From a perspective of a patient and family, most people don't know, nor do they understand, that these types of incidences occur. Most consumers, patients, and families would assume that if a mistake or an error is made with regard to something, that it would be readily admitted and rectified, because most of us just want to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. The culture that's been going on for decades of blame and shame has done so much harm in our country. And we really need to get rid of the punitive system. We also need to get rid of the litigious system that we have right now. And most of all, we need a safe haven for the providers, be it a nurse, a doctor, clinician, anyone who makes a mistake. They need a safe place to go in their environment to talk about this error that has occurred, because from all of the data that I've seen, most errors are systematic and not the fault of one provider. Therefore, if we don't have that safe haven for these people to go and talk about this, it's just going to internalize. And that would also create future potential errors to happen. So think about your family, your mother, your father, your wife, your husband, your child, your sibling, being in a situation in your facility where something happens and an error occurs, and the clinician is terrified to talk about it because of the culture. We must change this. And I just applaud everyone here on this, all of the providers on this webinar who are on board with these changes, because we need them. We need them yesterday. Again, thank you all so much. Dr. Denham, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, and I go back to David. David, the one area that Jenny, and thank you, Jenny, for a great comment. The one area that we really need to kind of work through is when a set of systems predispose a caregiver to make a mistake, and the senior leaders should know, hey, this is a system fault. This is their leadership systems, technology systems, and the process systems. When we know that a process like having a closed unit. The Julie Tao example that has been widely published, where you have a closed unit and they approve the fact that no matter what, we're not going to use traveling nurses, so that if you do back-to-backs, somebody's got to cover, and Julie had to cover on a weekend. And where does the responsibility lie with senior level leaders if they are putting people in harm's way, like pilots? If you're flying pilots so that they're so fatigued, how do they know that they're undertaking an at-risk or a behavior if they're impaired? And if they're impaired, not because of a substance, but just from fatigue.
Yeah, that's right, Chuck. And often the people who have the data are the leaders, and so they're the first to know that, like, the environment that we set up, the system we set up, isn't working. And if they see it as not working, they're tasked to fix that. So two things came up that I want to address. What Jenny had talked about is, how do we create that safe haven for people to raise their hand and say they made a mistake? And what happens in our culture today is when there's been harm occurs, we look in and we judge the person who, our providers that we look up to, that we trust, that they've caused some harm to our loved one, what could have been a human error. But we look in, and society looks in and says, wow, human error or falsification of record, they look the same to us. And just culture has to really distinguish those. There is a difference between the researcher knowingly falsifying medical research and simply a bad system that causes a human being to make a mistake that might cause harm. The other issue was with John's point is, often the self-interested behavior is the manager. Is rather than blame myself as the manager because I put you in a bad system, I'm going to blame my employee. So we do have organizations both in aviation and healthcare where the local manager goes through the algorithm and says, here's my answer, but then has to go defend the answer to an independent panel. So the procedural justice is having what John Nance talked about, those unbiased people at the table who are not in the management chain of the employee that we're judging, to say, show me how you went, show me your data, show me your event investigation, show me how you went through the algorithm, and the action doesn't occur with the employee until that independent panel approves. So there is a way, there are systematic ways to try to take that bias out of the system, because often the most biased person is the manager, who is frustrated that their employee made a mistake, and not only made the employee but them look bad. So how do you really take that out? And there's procedural ways to do that to try to ensure what John is talking about, that we don't come into it with the answer already before we pull out the algorithm. But again, it's a pleasure to be able to participate.
Great comments. And I guess one final thing is then our own justice system, when people like Eric Kropp and Julie Tao and others and all of us are at risk for prosecutorial misconduct, which we think, prosecutors will do whatever they can to make a case for a conviction, and they're taught to ignore the truth, but taught to build the case. And that's something that's so foreign to all of us. As a cancer doctor, I was always focused on the truth of the path report, not making the case for radiation treatment. However I could make the case, it was, well, you don't do it if you don't have cancer. So we live in a world where healthcare has to revolve around facts and truth. So it's a very interesting interface. I'd just like to thank everyone for being on this webinar. Terrific job. I really hope that you want more of these case studies and more from David Marx. David, I just commend you on great work. I want to thank Greg Boats and Chief Adcox for their great contribution. And Jenny, as always, you are just a super champion for the patients. And I'm going to, as always, we're going to let the patient have the last word. So God bless all of you. Next month will be End of Life with Gene Huddleston, Mortality Reviews. Would you take us home, Jenny?
Thank you so much, Dr. Denham. What an invigorating webinar. This is so important. Please take away everything that you heard today. Bring it home to your facilities. Share it with your colleagues. If you have family members, friends that are colleagues in other hospitals and other facilities, please share it with them. listen to this webinar online once it's posted, and please come back and invite all of your friends. I just humbly thank everyone here today for leading the way for the future, because this is such an important issue for patients and families, and it will save so many lives, and it will also save so many hearts from weeping and crying after errors and having nowhere to go, but internally and internalizing everything that has happened in the error. Thank you again, and God bless you all. See you next time, and back to you, Dr. Denham.
Great, and thank you. That ends our webinar, and if the speakers could stay on for just a quick performance improvement review just on what we could do better. God bless all of you. We'll see you next month.